So my name is Nason Mahboubi. I'm the director of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations at the University of Pennsylvania. We're a project which mostly tries to contribute to policy discussion about China in the United States by amplifying perspectives from next-generation scholars and experts on China in the United States who apply to our program through a competitive process. We currently are on our third cohort of fellows. Some of you may have heard the third cohort fellows when we came and did an event like this at JF Bookstore in September. And we will have a fourth cohort of fellows and fifth and sixth in the years to come. That model is sufficiently, I think, persuasive and compelling at this moment where so much of the world is confronting the implications of China's rise and trying to think through really complicated policy questions, that our project has had the opportunity to convene as well a group of really tremendous European next-generation scholars and experts on China from throughout Europe and also the UK. And that is the group that you see mingled around in the audience. Anyone who's wearing a lanyard like you see me wearing is part of that group. Altogether, we have 20 of the most outstanding scholars and experts on China from throughout the continent and the UK in DC this week, in the bookstore tonight. Really some of the most tremendous experts on China in any of the given countries that are here represented, whether it be Finland or Latvia, Greece, or many different countries. And of that group, we've selected 4 of them, who you see on my left here, to share some perspectives on the themes that we've heard as the title for tonight's discussion. Let me briefly introduce them. So on my left is Una Berzinia Cherenkova, who is the head of the China Studies Center at Riga Stratons University in Latvia, and soon to be the director of the Latvian Institute for International Affairs. And then to the left of her is Sam Gill, who is associate fellow at Chatham House in the UK. To the left of him, Marinia Rudiak, who is assistant professor at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. And to her left, Konstantinos Simonis, who is assistant professor at Pantheon University in Greece. All of them, as all the Europeans that you see in the audience tonight, over the course of the last few years, have been developing policy ideas through this initiative and are sharing them now with different audiences in DC, now publicly here at JF Books. And eventually we will have a book come out of this entire initiative, which maybe someday will be displayed in this bookshop in the years to come. So let's start with Una. We wanted to start with security because that is obviously, whether we're talking about the US policy discourse or the European policy discourse about China, really at the top of the list. And in Europe, as I think everyone in the audience can understand, the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and perceived Chinese potential support for Russia have been very challenging for European policymakers to think through. And of course, Una comes from Latvia, one of the Baltic states, so these issues are of particular resonance to her. So let me have Una go first, and then we'll go down the list from there.
So the point that I want to make is that European hard security is deprioritizing China currently. And why is that? Well, we often hear how European security is fragmented because Europe is a group, not unlike this group of many countries. However, they are all facing the same threat. They're all looking in one direction. So fragmented, yes, but looking in the same direction, focused on the war next door. And that, of course, is Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. And it's not getting better. The date, February 24, is coming up quickly, and we will be hitting 4 years of that. So what's happening? First of all, there's a commitment now among the NATO members to reach that threshold of 5% of security, part of 5% of GDP for security. Now, you can cut it and slice it different ways. Some of it is for capacity building, 3.5 for security, hard, but still it's a lot. And that immediately fuels a drive for homegrown security capabilities. Strongly advised not to mention the United States. In my first remarks, it will be hard, so I'm not mentioning the United States. But for some unexplainable reason, The European security homegrown capacity is getting strengthened now, and there's a reckoning that we need to take care of our own security. And that immediately creates risk of redundancy and inefficiency because pretty much every national security establishment is scrambling for some role in this. So what is it that we upload to our neighbors, and what is it that we can produce ourselves? Dilemma between, collective security and domestic industrial policy. Then there's also fragmentation, of course, going on. We see that some fringe actors are vindicated. Not everybody among the population is on board with support for Ukraine, unfortunately, because there's bread and butter issues, there's, ideological issues, and now, again, for reasons I shall not name, they have been kind of strengthened in Europe too. And I want to make the point that we are at risk of empowering forces in Europe, political forces, whose views on security are harmful for Europe. And by the way, they're very business first to these political forces, which is a euphemism for more China across the board, by the way. So how does that influence policy calculus in the European Union? Well, first of all, we see a rise in like-minded minilateral formats, so kind of friends getting together. One of them is the Nordic Baltic 8. You mentioned I'm from the Baltic states. We do see a lot of just drive in that direction. It's the 5 Nordic, 3 Baltic states, talking about security, not just talking about the Baltic Sea anymore. We see rolling back on climate goals, something that my colleague Sam will perhaps touch upon, which is very worrying in that trade-off between security and development. We see gray zone, we see the muddying of borders, what constitutes warfare? So there's a debate in Europe, what actually is warfare? Is a Belarusian balloon over Vilnius airport warfare? And the reckoning of having to go it alone, so there's a demand for unity, funds allocation, so it's quite visible, and China comes second here on the security calculus after Russia. China is being addressed mostly through the open strategic economy and economic, including research security framework, so not really hard security. So the main conclusion here that I want to make is that US disinvolvement and unpredictability on European security has a very strong implication. It creates the opposite effect of what is preferable for the US. Namely, Europe is withdrawing from any joint China approach, so any joint transatlantic China approach, in security, and is concentrating on its main current imminent threat.
Turning now to Costa Simonis, speak about investment issues, and of course we'll probably speak a bit about the Piraeus port in Athens, which the Chinese have invested in and has created a lot of discussion around Chinese investment, not only in Greece, but in other parts of Europe.
I'm a political scientist, and I'm going to talk about investment, which already demonstrates that it is a deeply political issue. I will start the story from 2008. So back to the financial crisis, that was definitely a turning point. And I will also want to say that Europe is not a monolith, so there is definitely not one view on China or on anything else. So we need to keep that in mind. So we'll try to identify the general trends and the general mood in Europe around Chinese investment. We have the 2008 crisis. Thank you for that. And then we have the Eurozone crisis that actually comes as a result of the 2008 crisis. Before that, Chinese investment is not like a big issue. We welcome investment. During the crisis, of course, Chinese investment becomes a viable source, a part of the solution, especially countries like Greece, like my own, that we faced an even greater crisis than the average European country did. So during that time, we were looking at China as a friendly investor coming to rescue some of our industries. At the same time, however, there are two things simultaneously that take place. First of all, China changes a lot. Okay, I don't need to explain what the rise of Xi Jinping has meant, from hostility and aggressiveness in the South China Sea to the persecution, some people call it genocide of the Uyghurs, right? China is becoming way more aggressive domestically and internationally. In Europe, what we have is that slowly, some circles start to realize that we are in a position of weakness. And there is a lot of political damage in our relations with each other. There is a lot of political damage in sense of Europe's standing because of the Euro crisis. And then we wake up one day and we realize some of our key infrastructures and some of our key companies have now been acquired by Chinese investors and Chinese companies. So there are of course thousands of cases like that, but the single most important case and really a turning point on how we thought about Chinese investment in Europe is the case of KUKA, a German robotics company that was acquired by Midea. So suddenly people were like, why are we losing a future-looking company like that? So why are we losing, why are we giving away to a third country that is not our ally such an important asset? After that, we have especially in circles in Brussels, we have national security concerns. People start looking at Chinese companies possibly as agents of the Chinese Communist Party. We are also looking at actual economic issues like reciprocity. We welcome Chinese companies into our rich markets, but we don't have the same level of access to Chinese markets, right? So and this becomes highly politicized. The case of KUKA, the case also of Piraeus, that suddenly such an important port was acquired by a Chinese company. All these things piled up, and then the EU did what it knows how to do best. That's regulate things to death. So we started introducing one mechanism after another. A very important anti-coercion mechanism, very important, or we thought it was at least, an investment screening mechanism that was of course the outcome of a compromise. And since then, we have adopted this logic of de-risking from China. So try to really minimize the risk involved in economic relations with the PRC. And this is more or less where we stand today. We're strong in this de-risking kind of mode of thinking and of policy making.
So I'm going to hand it over next to Sam Gio, who is, as I mentioned earlier, from Chatham House. We are not in this public event under the Chatham House rule, but if anyone is curious about what exactly is the Chatham House rule, this is the guy to ask. But Sam, before he joined Chatham House, spent almost 2 decades working with China Dialogue and was the president or the chief executive of China Dialogue, one of the major forces in discussions about climate in China. And so we've asked him to speak on the climate issue for today's purposes.
I mean, my specialism is really on what China's domestic environmental movement has done and how it's grown, and how China's state really took on environmental policy as state policy and really transformed the world through its climate policies. But to sort of speak to Europe for a moment, I think we've seen a convergence really between the way that Europe and China look at climate as an issue that fuses trade, industrial strategy, security, and goes far beyond the place that we maybe started 20 years ago. I think there was a shared recognition in China and in Europe that climate poses security vulnerabilities. China was already talking about this 20 years ago through integrated vulnerability assessments, looking at the effect on water, on energy, on food systems. And Europe similarly was, you had something called the Stern Review in the UK 20 years ago now, looking at the economic cost of climate change and the need to decarbonize our economies in order to avoid that cost. So there was a discussion about it as a deep concern for our economies, both in China and in Europe. There was a discussion about climate as a necessary part of multilateral cooperation and sort of global governance. Now that part, again, I'm not going to talk about the United States, but for many reasons, that part, if it feels obsolete, I think it's because it is. I think genuinely the climate conversation has moved far more into a competitive realm in which it's a discussion around trade, around industrial strategy, around security and competition. And that is very much of a piece with how China has always viewed it. Briefly, I think the Chinese government has seen how climate change is integral to the preservation of its own national self-interest, not only in terms of the climate vulnerabilities that China faces, but also in terms of the importance of economic upgrading, moving from energy-intensive, polluting manufacturing towards innovation and services, particularly through dominance of the technologies of the future, EVs, solar panels, batteries, things that again have been really laid out in long-term industrial strategy over the past 15 years at least. Also that it's critical to achieving governance goals, particularly addressing major concerns of publics in cities facing choking smog. It's been a really integral part of that, and it's really been highly successful in terms of dominating those industries, the entire value chains, of course associated with critical minerals, renewables, and the rest. And it's been achieved through unilateral action, largely. Yes, of course, there were major bilateral agreements, such as that between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping in 2014 that laid the ground for Paris. But the truth is, since then, even in light of US withdrawal from Paris and so on, China has stayed true at least to the cause of domestic decarbonization of its economy for strongly domestic reasons. And yet that means that we also see, of course, the continued reliance on coal as a major sort of share of the energy mix, and we can talk about that more in the discussion. But in the end, that's posed a major challenge for Europe's industries, for its trade, and that's really the kinds of issues that we're now facing. But I'll pass on to my colleagues, and we can talk more in the discussion about how you actually address that through policy.
And in this opening segment, we'll hear next from Marina, who's speaking on the development theme. And before she was an academic, spent many years in the development world as a practitioner. So she's perspective on this is deeply influenced by that background.
Yeah, Nathan asked me to talk about the European perspectives, and I do a lot of advisory for the German government and various EU actors on how to deal with China, what we call an emerging donor, except it's not really emerging because China has been giving aid as long as the People's Republic exists. Since the end of 1949, and has always been a donor and a recipient. By the way, not only China, India too. And I remember from doing my PhD that during the 1970s, there was a very lively debate in the West about China as a donor. And then once China became our recipient, the fact that China was continuing to give aid completely disappeared from our debates. And now, suddenly, in the mid-2000s, it's reappeared in Africa, except this was always there. And in Europe, we are faced now with a situation that China has moved from what we believe to be an emerging donor to a global architect of development finance. And through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing has managed to combine large-scale infrastructure lending with the promotion of its own development model. In the past decades, more implicitly, now very explicit with Xi Jinping saying in early, I think 2022, that, 23, China's development has shown that modernization does not have to equal Westernization, meaning you can modernize without following the European path and becoming a democracy. And this, of course, has reshaped the landscape in which the EU and the EU member states, on the development speak, we talk about Team Europe, which means the EU institutions and the member states. It has changed the landscape in which we operate as donors and development actors, in the sense that now China is a central provider of institutions and ideas for development. And all of that is happening at a time where European development finance flows are declining, also due to domestic pressures. In all of that landscape, and this is quite interesting because the development debate is actually very different than the debate in the sectors my colleagues are covered. And I don't work only on development, I also work on China and global governance, and sometimes I have the feeling that I live a very schizophrenic life, because depending on which bubble I am, the debates are very, very different. And in the development space, China is perceived both as a challenge, but also as a potential partner. And the EU has this trifecta that we say China is a systemic rival, an economic competitor, and a partner for global challenges. And if we look at the development space, we have frictions and we have overlaps. We have alignment on the need for poverty reduction. We have alignment on the sustainable development goals. I'm going to mention the United States because the United States officially withdrew from the SDGs. They are not MAGA conform. At the same time, of course, we have friction on issues like human rights and good governance. The question is, what does it mean for us as European development actors very practically? The advices I'm giving when I have the chance to do that go in two directions, actually three. One is, like, if you look at, okay, what's the role for us in Europe? Talk Africa, I mean, China and Africa have been cooperating since the mid-50s. And I asked the question that Sam and I were last year at a workshop together in Nairobi. And do they need us, Europeans, there? What's the role for us? But turns out we have actually something to bring to the table in the sense of there is a demand for capacity building on how to deal with China as a development actor. Because what we've seen is that countries that manage Chinese development finance well and manage to align it with their national development priorities and strategies actually gain more from what China has to offer. And if not, then they will be exploited. And I think China is actually the best case in itself. There is no recipient that managed aid as good as China did, and probably because it's been in the driver's seat from the start, and it was always making sure that whatever came in was fitting national development priorities. And whenever I have the chance to speak to the Chinese, I say, well, actually, this should be your biggest export, how to manage donors. The other thing is that we are seeing a lot of openness from the Chinese to engage on like really hardcore development issues, like debt sustainability, because it's also a problem for the Chinese government when countries don't repay. And we actually see for now that China is not really pressuring, but it's doing rescue lending. So it's stepping into a creditor trap. We also see a lot of interest in, like this hardcore things like monitoring and evaluation and looking into development effectiveness and looking, okay, does a Chinese project actually generate broader welfare effects? Or is it just that you have a road and the two capitals on the both sides of the road benefit? So this is a space where I think, and I've been advising, where we can, have a lot of exchange with the Chinese, because even if we don't do that actively, they're gonna learn from us, and they're doing it very actively. And the third thing is that when we do our own projects, it's really important not to make it about China. And one instance where this has been happening is Europe's own initiative, the Global Gateway, which has been very often framed as the European response to the Belt and Road Initiative, but the recipient countries don't perceive us as competitors. They actually perceive us as providers of complementary good. China providing hard infrastructure, we are providing soft infrastructure. Now, giving that advice, let's do trilateral cooperation with China and European capitals is a tricky one, because everybody says, yeah, but aren't we whitewashing the Chinese system? Aren't we actually helping China to become a better authoritarian donor and creating, a better image for China in the recipient countries? But I don't believe in that, because this argument pretends that recipients have no agency. And this is wrong, for one thing. The other thing is, in the end, if Chinese projects are more sustainable, recipients benefit. And third, and this is something I think and I'm gonna end with that, what we really can learn from China in terms of narratives is framing, and not only framing, but understanding development as a shared issue. Because the Chinese government talks about win-win cooperation, community of shared future for mankind, and development as a shared challenge, while we in Europe, and I actually believe it's probably also true here, still treat development as their problem there, somewhere in the global south, and this needs to change because it isn't.
Great, thank you all. So over the course of this week in Washington, D.C., but also over the course of the last few years of this initiative and these discussions, we've circled around a few different problems. So one problem is the difficulty of the debates within any given European country about how best to meet the new challenges posed by China, whether in any of these four different spheres. A second question is the difficulty of coordination at the EU level. So one level issue is just within each European country, then another issue is coordination at the EU level, and then the third is how to best coordinate with the United States, especially when the signaling from the United States may be shifting over time from administration to administration, both in terms of China policy, but also in terms of transatlantic relations. So the question I want to pose to each of you is, when you think of those three different problems, which is the most important problem from your perspective for each of your different issue sets?
I'm not saying that it's necessarily the most important one, but it would take some thinking, right, to rank them. But I am going to touch upon your third point because of the audience, because of the venue. So there are different ways how European governments are approaching the transatlantic challenge that we have now on China, but also just about on any other issue. There are two schools of thought. There are people who are saying outright, this is a problem. We cannot really work with this administration. They don't want to work with us, first of all. And then there are smaller actors who are projecting a strategic narrative that all's well under the sun. This is a specific approach of the current administration, but it is mostly rhetorical and it is mostly performative. And the undercurrent remains that the transatlantic link is so strong that this cannot break it. I guess it will be your election at the end of the day that will show which approach was right. But I'm not necessarily a critic of the second approach because I believe that even under such circumstances, we still need to respect the decades of partnership, hope that we can build on. I don't know, sorry, just a little bit of ideology here from Lavia.
Okay, so that's the $1 million question. Nathan, very difficult one when it comes to discussing coordination and Europe. I think in a way there is one solution to all this, and that's for Europe to rediscover its vision, because we have been, at least I would say since the 1990s, 2000, with the introduction of the euro, we have been just moving through history without a vision, without a compass. We're trying to maintain what we have gained, and what we gained is very important because we used to slaughter each other every now and then, and so the European experiment has been very successful. So I think that the only solution to all these coordination problems is further integration. We need to finally move to the direction of becoming the United States of Europe. If we don't do that, we will be at the mercy, of people like Putin or of other people that I'm not going to mention that want to divide us.
Yeah, lots of different parts to the question. I mean, starting with my country, with the United Kingdom, China has presented a coordination challenge, clearly. It's something where we needed to work across different silos beyond foreign policy in order to understand why it was important across business, across trade, across climate. And that's been relatively effective. It's slow, it's complicated, but I do actually think the UK has put in place some strategy and policy to underpin that. There's an overarching framework called Challenge, Compete and Cooperate. It's these sort of three areas. And actually, I think while it's very general, it does lay out the sort of different ways in which one needs to think about China across every single sector of the economy and society. And it sort of provides a bit of a basis for how you break through those silos and think in a coordinated way about the sort of challenge that any type of encounter with China is going to present. And I would say, well, one of the problems about climate is, of course, it's thought of as sitting under engage or cooperate, when actually, as I've said in my remarks briefly, it's also about competition, it's also about security. Any one issue, if you look at EVs, if you look at some of the more complex kind of technological concerns that now present the United Kingdom, are going to be understood as security concerns, as competitiveness concerns, but also are going to require industrial cooperation, are going to require coordination with China because of China's dominance of these supply chains and because just that's the only way you can work on this shared problem. And this is the thing about climate, it requires the same, well, actually a far more sophisticated level of coordination, because climate is not really a problem. It's best described as something like a wicked problem. It's highly complex. Dealing with any one issue brings up other issues. It actually requires, addressing climate is like talking about addressing poverty or something. It's not a singular issue with a singular kind of solution one can use to address it. How do we then coordinate with our partners in Europe? Well, we're not going to become part of the United States of Europe, sorry, Costas. But there is actually strong coordination both on climate and on China. And there's no particular reason why we can't continue that to a relatively deep degree. But then on the next issue, which is how do we coordinate with the United States, when the US has withdrawn from not only the Paris Climate Agreement, but actually a whole set of multilateral agreements, has completely sort of ceded the multilateral space to others. It's a far more complex and existential sort of crisis actually for Europe, and one that we really need to put our minds to.
I think kind of the beauty of the development sector is that there are common standards. Donor countries have agreed on the Development Assistance Committee. There are development standards with the EU, so that by itself is not a problem of coordination. What is China, and that is that throughout the EU, both within the EU institutions, but also within the member states, China is still treated like a China in China issue and not as a transversal issue as it is, which means that in, for instance, Africa departments or World Bank departments, we do not necessarily have China competence. So this is something that needs to be addressed. The question how to coordinate with the United States is one I don't know how to answer it at the moment, because it seems like for now the US has withdrawn from development cooperation. And that is really the problem, because the whole space of global governance has been, in a way, left to the EU and China, with the problem that Europe is perceived more part of the problem than part of the solution. Because I would dare to say most of the global south, if not all, share China's analysis of the problem with the existing global governance system. China hasn't really put a solution on the table, except for the initiatives, including the new global governance initiative and the Friends of the Global Governance, but these are not initiatives, these are political campaigns. So there is no solution on the table, and the question is, will we be able to come up with a solution before the rest of the world loses any hope that the system can be reformed? And I don't know if that's gonna happen, but my wish would be something that Jonathan Glennie actually suggested, to come up with a system that is similar to the European Union, which would change completely how we do development. Namely, the EU functions in a way that everybody pays in, depending on their capabilities, and gets out how much they need. So everybody is a donor and a recipient. And I think, if this whole system is to survive, we need a reform that moves into that direction, which moves away from donors, recipient, to shared ownership and shared responsibility.
What we've been asking all the participants in this Transatlantic and European Dialogue to do is to develop concrete, actionable recommendations for either European or transatlantic policymakers that can somehow improve the response to the challenge that China poses across different fields. And so my question to each of you is, what is your best recommendation on each of your issue areas, whether it's security or investment or climate or development, and whether it's articulated to European policymakers or transatlantic policymakers, whether at the EU level or at the country level, what is the single best recommendation that you have that best meets the challenge that China poses in that issue area?
This is coming from a very hands-on approach of cooperating in resisting hybrid threats. I see that the hybrid threat landscape is evolving so quickly, and there's so much learning happening there between actors who are acting in bad faith, that outside of ideologies, outside of how we see the world, we have a very direct need to cooperate on finding solutions against these hybrid threats, right? I spoke earlier about the threshold of warfare, basically, and we are being challenged and in all directions at that. And just an example, there's cable cutting in the Baltic Sea, and we've had some sort of case by case, and probably not government to government, but still China-Russia cooperation on that. So I think this is the low-hanging fruit, as my colleagues like to call it, in cooperation right now.
So when it comes to investment in Europe, I'm afraid I'm going to give a slightly boring answer, referring to existing mechanisms that we have. We managed to create in 2019, it's up to now, I think it prioritizes too much the role of the independent member states. So I think that the way forward for that would be to give teeth to the mechanism and bring it to the EU level. So we have a more, let's say, common approach. We don't need to have, let's say, Greeks deciding on whether an investment from China in Greece is the right thing. We need to have like a more European perspective on that, so that also we avoid competition between us, right? So I think that again, the solution to these kind of problems lies to further integration of the EU and starting to do things at that level, not so much at the national level.
I think with climate, we need to be doing everything at once. It's very difficult to separate out a single policy recommendation that would be the best thing that Europe could do right now. But I would say we need to avoid some of the mistakes of the past. In 2016, when Trump was first elected, and in 2017 as he came into office and withdrew from Paris, Europe focused a lot on how can we rebuild the EU-China relationship at the multilateral level to replace what had existed between the US and China. And it was actually not a great effort. I think a far more important one would have been to really focus on how do we develop our own industrial strength and competitiveness at home with regard to climate technologies and clean tech, and really think about how we work, including constructively with Chinese partners on developing that in a meaningful way. And I also think we really need to work with partners in the global south to think about actually what their needs are, including through actually trilateral cooperation, which my colleague has mentioned, which I think actually does present really important opportunities for thinking about actually the need for cheap, clean energy access across the majority world.
Yeah, I think I can second much of what Sam said, because the issues of development and the issues of climate are very similar. And my biggest recommendations, I said, is let's change the way how we think about development. But starting with low-hanging fruits, I think we should start with what works or what seems feasible, and that would be very pragmatic dialogues with Chinese partners on the really hardcore stuff of development cooperation and trilateral cooperation projects. Because why not do a multi-stakeholder, multi-level approach? Yes, we have very hardcore security and infrastructure and investment challenges, so let's treat that as a competitor and rival issue, but let's cooperate where it's possible, and that is development and climate.
The hottest international relations issue in Washington in the last week has been framed that refers to Greenland. It's supposed to be, the idea is you need to protect it from China. The question that arises is, so do you think this makes sense and Europe would support what is going on? I know everybody has to make a noise, but eventually is Europe going to agree to all this?
Thank you for the question. Of course, my first instinct when Mason asked the question about cooperation and security, my first instinct was to say, well, it's hard to imagine cooperation when an ally is talking about taking a territory from another ally against the wishes of not just the ally, but also the territory. But I overcame that instinct because that is such an evident conclusion. So I agree with you. It is a massive issue. And there is, the way, of course, the Danish Prime Minister addressed it is that this would be the end of everything, and this would be absolutely devastating, and of course it already chips away at the trust that we had accumulated and we're now sort of squandering. I think we are waiting and seeing what's going to happen with our just holding our breath at the edge of the seat, but already, I think that is the point that some of my colleagues have made, is that the situation already has broken trust. So in a sense, it's not, right now already a threshold has been crossed. It's not about us being afraid that the threshold will be crossed in the future. It has been crossed. You as the furthest person from Greenland.
I am indeed the furthest person from Greenland, but I also come from a country that has had problems with a NATO ally for decades. So we have been facing aggression by Turkey for decades within the context of NATO. So I will use my experience from living in the UK for almost 15 years, and I would say keep calm and carry on. Okay, we will see exactly how this is going to unfold. I don't think it's the end of everything. I don't think it is impossible for us to rebuild trust. There is a lot of exaggeration in what Trump is doing, what he's saying. But let's see how this thing is going to unfold.
And so I just wanted to get your perspectives. Do you see any of that popping up in Europe with respect to both push and pulls of having scholarly exchange, especially young people coming to Europe to train and what that implies about the themes that you discussed?
It's an evolving question in any European country. In the UK, for a long time, there wasn't any degree of kind of screening or scrutiny of foreign students, and that shifted very markedly in the last few years, to the extent that it's been quite highly securitized. And these are evolving regimes. As I understand it, it now has got to the point that it's quite concerning for example, social scientists. I have Chinese social science colleagues, for example, who have found their work in areas that are actually quite non-sensitive, but if they touch in any regards issues related to, for example, electricity grids, things because of their work on climate, then these are hit by kind of very renewed screening. So yes, those sorts of security concerns are starting to come into the environment for academic exchange in the UK.
My biggest worry from all this is it's actually the students themselves, because they're being stigmatized as potential spies. But on the other hand, some of them have been under pressure from the Chinese embassies. We have had instances of students from China telling us that they are concerned that other students are spying on them. So I think that to get a compass, we need a moral compass when we deal with this issue. And that's the pastoral duties that we have as educators. I think that's the most important. And also, of course, we shouldn't be treating like every Chinese individual as a spy. This is clear racism, right? So it's not an easy question, but I think universities need to reflect on their pastoral duties and whether they deliver that, because education in the UK and in parts of Europe here as well has become a commodity, a very high-priced commodity. Our students, and especially our international students, we treat them as supermarket clients. Now we need to get away from all that and remember that we are teaching young people important things that they want to learn.
Speaking for the German case, I think our situation is healthier because our education is not commercialized. So we don't depend on student fees. We had a very intense debate in the last few years, of which I was part of. I think we are doing comparatively well in the sense that we managed to connect in this debate the natural sciences and the people, who have labs and work in really sensitive issues with China scholars who can assess with which Chinese universities are potentially problematic and which are not. We had the debate whether we should generally stop accepting China Scholarship Council fellowship students and PhD students. So far, we continue to accept them. There is an increased screening, there is an ongoing debate, but it's, I would say, nowhere kind of as intense in the UK and not as toxic as it is here, even though, and it doesn't mean that we're not taking it serious. We take it very serious, but we are also, I think, now quite clear that we really need to distinguish between PhD students who work in labs with laser technology and social scientists who, come to work in libraries. And this is an ongoing process and an ongoing debate. But in Germany, the autonomy of universities is really, really strong. So basically nobody can really tell a professor what to do, except they violate export control regulations. So for now, this is kind of the angle we are trying to take, to create kind of a regulatory framework and the place where universities or professors can go and approach, okay, is it a problematic university, is it a problematic candidate, to resolve it, case by case instead of demonizing all Chinese students and researchers.
I'm just going to add a word on this because in my own work I spend a lot of time thinking about dynamics of student exchange between the US and China. And so the first point I just want to put on the table is that for many of us, I'm a social scientist, essentially a legal scholar, who think about this issue, who are not in the sciences. We often kind of cabin the sciences. So I think a lot about my students who are not science students being able to go to China to study and non-science students from China coming to the US, because I understand that the science and technology portion of the exchange conversation is a lot more complicated, given that we have really settled into dynamics of competition between the US and China. I think to the extent that for the foreseeable future, the fundamental dynamic between the US and China, and maybe between Europe and China, will be one of strategic competition, it is almost inevitable that the landscape of scientific student exchange will be affected by that. The other points that I wanted to put in this context is, to the extent that I've thought about what the European discussion around similar issues are, it has been made clear to me, and I don't know if you would all agree with this, but there are some in Europe who will argue that, at least in the US, concern about competition and its implications for science and technology exchange has led to a marked increase in focus on research security in our universities, and at least some people in the European context seem to feel that that has not happened within Europe. That whereas in the US and many institutions, perhaps in yours as well, there is a heightened attention to research security, that just does not happen to be the case in Europe. And so there may be a lag in that discussion, but it may eventually catch up. But then the last point I want to put on the table, which is just a complication, it's not to argue one way or the other, but many of the discussions in this vein concern about Chinese students and scholars in our science labs here. The premise of that conversation is that our science is better, and they are going to come and take what our better science is and take it back to China. I think that premise is no longer necessarily true. There are certainly instances in which scientific and technological knowledge and innovation is actually exceeds in China that in US or Europe. And what will be super interesting, just as an intellectual matter, will be to see whether the Chinese securitize that on their side, which I would more or less bet on. Because when governments see this competition dynamic, if they think that they are ahead in something, I am quite confident that they will have the same kinds of restrictions in terms of scientific exchange on the things that they think they're better at. And we may start to think, oh, we actually would like exchange on those types of technologies because we want to learn from China. Again, it's a very complicated question, and I don't think I've tried to say something definitive on either way, but I think some of these additional layers of complication make it a really interesting question.
I was curious, how do the European governments view China's role in the war in Ukraine? And do they view China as being behind Russia or like a major decisive factor in the continuation of the war? And if so, what are European governments, or what are the discussions going on around the policy circles about what to do in regards to China to stop the war?
Thank you. I'll take this one, and this will be a Nordic-Baltic perspective, and perhaps a Polish one as well, is that yes, China is a critical enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. There are certain red lines that China does not want to cross. We saw some, sort of stepping back in the financial sector at the moment when the U.S. had a big stake, or the powers came together and signaled that, we're not going to let you guys do this. But overall, of course, when it comes to weapons components, when it comes to anything really, sanctions, sanction circumvention, China is a major supporter. And that is how the communication with every Chinese ambassador in our region starts, is about this sort of the message. Now when it comes to the approach, there's different approaches. One, which was, I think, kind of personified by President Macron when he visited Beijing a few years back, was sort of ask the Chinese not to support the Russians nicely, right? And then there's another approach, which is just reckoning that what Russia uses as its pretext for its invasion, that there is some support to that story, to that narrative on the Chinese side, and there's also a very strong geopolitical perception that in this case it's better to have Russia's back than to turn against Russia. And those actors then, including the actors in my country, do not believe that you can somehow persuade China to change course unless there's strong, united pressure involved. Having said that, I do have to say that my colleagues have pointed out that there's also some back channeling going on with China's actors showing up in Ukraine and wondering, what we can do, how we can re-engage a little bit, so kind of playing both sides here. And the Russians have noticed that at all, as well. Apologies.
Kind of maybe to add to that, I mean, it's not probably not very helpful, but I think every European head of state and minister who goes to China talks that China supporting Russia touches upon our core security interests in Europe. At the same time, I think we have to be realistic. China is not going to drop Russia because they have their own very clear security interests with Russia. And every time we raise that, they tell us, well, we have this 4,000 kilometer long border and we need to manage them. And China is not interested in Putin winning because who knows, he may get some appetite for Central Asia. It's not interested in Putin losing because a democratic Russia is also not very interesting for China. But I keep telling my Chinese colleagues that maybe kind of a democratic Russia would be the most stable thing and actually best in your interest. They don't believe me that. But an interesting thing, and this is not on the government level, but if we talk academics to academics, it took our Chinese colleagues really a long time to understand that Russia invading Ukraine is a problem for us in Europe. And I have a colleague who is a Russia scholar who spent a lot of time in Germany and in the United States. And he told me, I thought for you guys, it's kind of a peripheral issue. And peripheral, yeah. So even like for people where you would think, they're in constant exchange with their European and American, Western colleagues, to understand that it's really our core security interest. It's not somewhere on the borders. It's really, really a hardcore issue for us. I'm not sure everybody understood that in China, even among those who actually do advise the Chinese government.
And let me just a reminder, Wang Yi in July 2025, in a meeting with European officials, he actually said that we cannot let Russia lose. That's a fact that happened.
Sure, but thank you for this. And I do want to underscore, I hope you've noticed that the perspectives you've heard on stage today, if you tried to kind of synthesize them, they wouldn't easily fit in one part of the spectrum of, let's say a spectrum of different perspectives to China. You've got a lot of different views here, and that's the hallmark of the Penn Project and the Future of U.S.-China relations. We don't put a thumb on the scale in terms of the actual policy recommendations. All we're trying to do, whether it's with our American fellows or the European participants in this project, or with the new Asia-Pacific participants in the new initiative we've just launched, all we're trying to do is elevate thoughtful, granularly specialized expertise in policy discussion, wherever that may be. And so thank you all for illustrating that point in this wonderful discussion tonight.